Zapraszam. Please come to the stage, Thomas. Before we start the presentation, I would like to ask you about this electromobility. So, is electromobility the only right way, the only direction, or do we have a choice, or we should other paths, other ways?
So I'm going to talk about this actually in the presentation, but I think we need to differentiate between the transport sectors a bit. And when it comes to cars and road transport, passenger vehicles, at least from our perspective, it really is electromobility that is the way forward. Because the competing technologies are either not mature, less energy efficient. So indeed, when it comes to cars, we do think that we're moving to 100% electrification in the future.
So I would ask you another way. If not electromobility, then what? Is there other
Then
way?
we're running into trouble because we need to do something about this climate change issue. So we need electric cars on the roads.
Okay, so this is the only right way. So the floor is yours. Szanowni Państwo, zapraszam na prezentację dotyczącą właśnie przyszłości, dotyczącą elektromobilności, tego, w jakim kierunku nasz świat powinien powinien zmierzać, by żyć w zgodzie z naturą. Proszę.
Thank you. So good evening. I'm going to talk tonight about Fit for 55, which is a new EU legislative package. If you don't know about it, you learn all about it tonight. And EU road transport and what the future is for road transport, both in the EU but also a bit about the Polish level, as far as we can see it, at least from Brussels. So maybe to start a bit of background on what I do and what we do. So I'm the policy officer at AVERE, the European Association for Electromobility. I lead our policy work. AVERE has been existing since 1978, kind of in the context of the oil crisis, looking for alternatives, how can we get independent from fossil fuels? And still today, we've grown our network, but our activities, but the vision has always stayed the same. It's a strong electromobility industry in Europe, clean, quiet, healthy cities, energy-efficient transport, and, as I just mentioned, independence from fossil fuels. And we have now a diverse network across the continent and the entire e-mobility value chain. We have national associations in membership, research institutes, private companies, but also EV users. So we're really a broad church bringing together the entire sector and the entire ecosystem in the interest of electromobility. So nowadays, we have 32 members in 20 member states, and a quick shout out to the Polish Alternative Fuels Association, PSPA, who, as far as we can see, are doing great work here in Poland. And via these associations, we represent over 2,300 industry members indirectly and over 100,000 EV users. And on behalf of them, we advocate in Brussels with policymakers for ambitious EV policy, plus we offer a forum for exchange, best practices, networking, etc. So that's kind of the dual function of the association. Now, enough about us. Let's try to move on. And I've been invited to talk about the mobility of the future. And I think the best way to start is maybe with a little scoping exercise, because the mobility of the future is many things. So many people are saying that it is autonomous. You see, the Tesla autopilot, Google is working on autonomously driving cars, all the big players are in there. So will we still have drivers in the future? Smart and connected mobility, how much AI, interconnectedness will we have in the future? Shared mobility. Will we still have car ownership, or will we use car sharing models? Do we need to have our own car, each one of us? Active mobility. Do we actually need cars, or are we cycling in the future? And obviously electric mobility, and since we don't have infinite time, and since I also wouldn't know what I was talking about since on the at least the first two, we're going to stick to electric because that's part of my job description. So I'm going to focus on these for the next 28 minutes or however much is left. And so why do we need electric cars? I've just mentioned the climate change issue. So we're seeing here where we are right now. We're closing in quite rapidly on 1.5 degrees of global warming. And we see that that already has quite some severe consequences. So we see wildfires in Greece. We saw the floods in Germany and Belgium. So we're really starting to notice the consequence of climate change. And that's at nearly 1.5 degrees. If we do nothing, then towards the end of the century, we're at 4. So more than double. Nearly triple, actually, to what we have today. Problematic. So we need to do something about it. We need to take decisive actions, really substantially cut emissions, so that by the end of the century, we are at least close to today's levels, and we don't see these catastrophic consequences really ramping up in the future. And Transport has a very substantial role to play in this. So we see here all greenhouse gas emissions in the EU, and this quarter that you see there is transport emissions. So very significant share, and then out of these 25%, 20% are passenger cars with 15%, and trucks and buses with another 5%. So it's really a substantial share of EU emissions that we need to decarbonize and need to get rid of if we want to reach the EU's climate aims, which I'm going to talk about now. So sorry, a bit text heavy, I'm going to run you through it, so you don't need to read all of this. So I'm going to start with the European Green Deal. European Green Deal is kind of the flagship kind of project of the current European von der Leyen Commission. It's a major overhaul of EU environment and climate policy, and the headline target is really to be climate neutral in the EU by 2050. Net greenhouse gas neutrality, plus some other stuff, circular economy, air pollution, sea pollution is really quite broad and all-encompassing, but the headline target is this climate neutrality. Now that's only an ambition, but this ambition has now been legally enshrined in the so-called European Climate Law, April of this year, where this 2050 neutrality target has been inscribed into EU law and is now legally binding. So we have kind of given ourselves an obligation to be climate neutral by the middle of the century. And actually in 2030 already, the EU wants a reduction of 55% compared to pre-industrial times, so compared to 1990. Quite ambitious. And then lastly, maybe for background, the vision for transport specifically is laid out in the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy, as it's called, where the EU targets at least 30 million zero-emission vehicles and 3 million recharging points in the EU by 2030, and nearly exclusively zero-emission vehicles on the road by 2050. So by 2050, the EU wants no more polluting cars on EU roads. And we see here for the EU, this is historical emissions, and this is where we would be heading without actions. And now what we need to do basically is to introduce policy measures with these new binding targets that bring us on this red trajectory if we choose a linear path. So it's quite a significant reduction that we need. And that's where EVs come in, and this is a nice study, I hope you can kind of see it, from our friends at Transport Environment, which is an NGO that works in Brussels. This is petrol overall emissions over the life cycle. So this little dark blue part is the car production for an internal combustion engine car, and this is through driving, through the life cycle, how much is used in terms of CO2 emissions, how much is emitted. And then you see the same for an electric car with kind of average car and battery production, so the light blue part is battery production, that's also steadily coming down. And then here, the driving and electricity part. And you see that on average, today, petrol and diesel cars emit almost 3 times more across the EU than electric vehicles over their life cycle. Now in Poland, because the energy mix is not quite as clean yet as in other EU countries, we see that it's still slightly higher than in other EU countries, but even on the Polish electricity mix, which is quite coal-heavy still, you have 29% less emissions over the life cycle. And you see also here, those are rapidly coming down. This is the projection for 2030, so it's basically going to half. We see in Poland also these offshore wind projects, for example, that are being pushed very strongly. So this is the development where we're going, and we really see that it's much cleaner in terms of CO2. I'm going to quickly talk about hydrogen and e-fuels because the question about alternative was asked before. Because often when we talk about electrification and people ask, well, why can't we just make synthetic fuels, keep driving internal combustion cars, why do we have to go electric? The main reason here is really energy efficiency, because it's just much more efficient to just use electricity stored in a battery, use it to propel a car. If you, for example, go with hydrogen, where you have to make it from renewable electricity, so it's carbon neutral, if you make it from gas, it's not, then you already lose electricity converting it into hydrogen and then back into electricity, so you end up using only 33% of the renewable energy you put in, whereas with electric cars you use 77%. And we see that might slightly change in coming years, so overall still double the efficiency for battery electric vehicles. And renewable energy is and will remain a scarce resource, so we really need to use it for electric cars. They're also cleaner when they're driven on fossil fuels, or mostly fossil fuels, as I've just shown, but still we need to make sure that we use the renewable energy we have efficiently. And for e-fuels, it's actually even worse, you can see on the right side. So that's why we need to go for electrification, or one of the reasons why that's the way forward. So where are we today, before I turn to the policy proposals? Today we are, in terms of passenger cars in the EU overall, with purely battery electric vehicles at around 500,000, bit over 500,000 in 2020. For this year we'll have to see how this develops. in terms of new registrations, by the way, not stock. So these come on top. And we really see with hybrids, it's actually over 1 million. It's growing very rapidly, and we see this near exponential growth. It's actually nice to have an exponential curve that's not COVID once in a while, so that's good to see. And over the EU, we really see this very rapid growth in recent years. And when we move to Poland, I mean, we're on a lower level here. So overall, we have 3,500 purely battery electric vehicles, and then roughly the same number of hybrids to match as of last year, as far as we see from the data in the European Alternative Fuels Observatory. But again, we have this exponential growth, and we really see things picking up. And Poland, I think, has very exciting growth potential. When I came out of the airport, I got onto a bus, and it said, sorry for butchering your language, jestem elektryczny, something like that. So I am electric. And Solaris, Polish company, we have battery production here that's really, I've been told 2% of exports, something in that dimension. So really exciting potential also in Poland, although the market is in an earlier stage. This is mirrored also for charging infrastructure. Here we go. So in the EU, as of last year, we had around 300,000 charging points, most of which were these in yellow, the normal power charging, and then fast chargers, about 35,000, 40,000 last year. Again, this is growing very rapidly so that there is more charging to match these additional cars, public charging points that is. And in Poland, again, very similar trajectory, up to 3,000 charging points as of this year. Here we go. Right. So again, text-heavy slide, but what's happening on the EU? As you can see, it's quite a lot. So these have been the files end of 2020. Now the big package in July, which is, by the way, not a comprehensive list. That's about a third of what has been presented. Then now in Q4, we have another proposal coming up, and then 2022. And I think the ones I want to highlight and talk about today are the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, which is for deploying public charging, and CO2 emission standards for cars and vans, which is about accelerating the trajectory that we're moving. Plus, also, I won't talk in detail about it, but we'll soon, actually next week or the week after next, see the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive being presented. That will be very important for private charging for people at home. Next year, we might actually see CO2 emission standards for trucks as well. Going to focus on cars today for reasons of time. But yeah, lots going on. So, CO2 emission standards for cars and vans is, I think, where I'm going to start. So basically, there are these CO2 emission standards that set targets for manufacturers. How much can your new sales emit across their fleet? And there have been new proposed targets, and I think the headline one that maybe you have heard of already is this full phase-out of all non-zero emissions vehicles by 2035. So basically, if it runs on an internal combustion engine, it probably won't be able to be sold anymore in terms of new cars. All new cars will be electric or hydrogen. Don't personally believe in it, but there's technically the gateway for hydrogen. And by 2030, emissions levels need to be reduced by 55% compared to today across the fleet. So that will really require a lot of new electric vehicles. Quickly, how we view the proposal as AVERE. Obviously, we're an e-mobility lobby, so we are pushing for more ambitious ones. So we're happy that there has been this clear phase-out, that there has been increased ambition for 2030, but I think we can actually go more ambitious, and we can phase out by 2030 for new sales. So you will be allowed, just to reassure you, to drive your existing non-electric car. But in terms of new sales, by 2030, we think it's feasible to just sell electric vehicles. And it's actually necessary given that, especially in Eastern Europe, a lot of cars are relatively old, third-hand, fourth owner. So if we really want them off the road in 2050, and they often stay on the road for more than 15 years, then 2035 is actually rather late. Also throughout the next decade, we don't see a sufficient target set. I won't bore you with all the details. There are still incentives for hybrids, which we think is not really a solution because they're not zero emissions. Often they're never charged, these plug-in hybrids, and they just drive around on their internal combustion engine carrying a heavy battery. So we see potential for improvement, but I think what you can take away here is that in a few years' time, in about a decade plus minus, a few years, there might not be new combustion engine vehicles to buy, so it is really coming, this revolution. And this is supplemented on the charging side by this new Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, which wants to make sure that there is enough charging infrastructure across the EU with two kinds of targets: fleet-based capacity targets, so basically per electric car there needs to be a certain capacity of charging installed, and distance-based targets along key motorways, so that every 60 kilometers there is a charging point, so that if you go along with your car, you never have to be afraid to run out of juice, right? So you have like 300-400 kilometers range in a modern electric vehicle. If every 60 kilometers you have a charging station, that's more than enough to recharge on the way. Plus you have a number of other provisions on pricing, price transparency, payment methods, currently big debate in Brussels, should there be an obligation for credit cards? So all these kind of things are being debated. But the real big news are these binding targets for member states to build charging infrastructure, which we're very happy with, because these fleece-based targets, often we talked about this chicken and egg problem, right? So charging operators say, we can't deploy charging infrastructure because there's no business case, there's no electric cars. Car makers say, because customers don't want the vehicles, because we don't have charging infrastructure, they don't know where they want to charge. Now that we have this, this mechanism that for every electric vehicle there has to be charging infrastructure to come with it, we end this chicken and egg cycle, and we introduce kind of a horse and carriage dynamic, that the horse, the cars are leading, and the carriage, the infrastructure, follows very closely. And then with the distance-based targets, we end range anxiety for customers, as I've just elaborated. So that's all great. What's to improve? I think one thing that I want to underline is that these target levels really only kick on, these capacity targets only kick in once there is electric cars, because the infrastructure needs to come with them. Where there are no electric cars yet, those are not effective. So what we would like to do is introduce some kind of floor for markets where there's not many electric vehicles yet. For example, many markets in Eastern Europe, that there has to be a minimum of infrastructure, and after that these targets should kick in, so that in every country in Europe people can be certain that they can charge. So that's something we're advocating for in Brussels. Now, I'm going to quickly run through some other measures. We have a new emissions trading system for transport, where fuel suppliers up the value chain will have to pay for CO2 emissions of fuels that they supply to transport. That might come with higher fuel prices for users, quite problematic. The idea is to have a so-called social climate fund to compensate for this. We'll have to see whether this works. Revised renewable energy directive, we talked before about how emissions come down if we use renewable energy for cars. That's basically addressed in that proposal. And then EPBD, Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, I've mentioned it at the start. That's for private charging at home, because electric vehicles are slightly different from traditional vehicles. You don't go to the fuel station and refuel. Often you just recharge at home in your driveway if you have one, or in the shared parking. So that's where that will come in. And well, we're talking a lot about fleets, and so I couldn't resist to put a little pitch in on why fleet vehicles are so important and why you should decarbonize and electrify your fleet. So again, I promise it's one of the last text-heavy slides, but today company cars form an important part of the new vehicle sales. Over 60% of sales in the EU are company vehicles. And that means that they have a disproportionate share of emissions as well, especially since they drive around 2.25 times more. So majority of cars, and they drive around much more, emit much more. These need to be decarbonized as a priority. And then lastly, they often enter the second-hand market rather quickly. So these are leased out to companies for 2, 3, 4 years, and then they come to the used car market, where they are affordable for users that cannot necessarily afford a new car. So really important to make electric cars affordable, and that's why we are pushing for dedicated fleet regulation, obliging operators to buy electric vehicles, and ideally ahead of this general timeline of phasing out internal combustion, because of this key role of bringing EVs to the market. And then you're going to tell me, well, why are you trying to force me into buying electric vehicles? I don't want to, they're expensive, whatever. And let's look at the price. So these are the 4-year total cost of ownership of different drivetrain technologies. For example, if you have petrol ICE, this is this orange line right here. And then here electric vehicles are this yellow dotted line. And we see that we're really quickly approaching purchase cost parity over the first 4 years, about 2023. If you keep it longer than 4 years, then already they're cheaper to run, because electricity is cheaper than fuel. I mean, right now we have a price hike, but generally still you save over the period that you own the vehicle. And in 2024, if you looked at a 4-year TCO, you're going to save money. And then you're telling me, okay, but the upfront cost. So we're saving money over time, but we have to justify the upfront investment. It's a big step to make. If you look at the estimates that we have from Bloomberg, then we see that in 2026, 2027, in all car segments, electric vehicles will be the same price as a comparable ICE vehicle. So they will be cheaper to buy and cheaper to run. It won't be just a matter of protecting our environment, but also our wallet and our budget, which is a nice two birds with one stone move. You have climate benefits. So, as I said earlier, 29% cleaner on the Polish electricity mix. You have less air pollution and less noise in cities. Chronic stress is a massive health issue in Europe. You have over 400,000 deaths annually through air pollution. Battery technology is developing extremely quickly. Prices are coming down, ranges are going up, they're getting lighter. And then EU policy, as I said earlier, are guaranteeing this uptake of public charging infrastructure in line with EV uptake. And then, lastly, before I wrap up, maybe I want to quickly talk about employment, because something that's also often said is, well, if we make this switch, then we're going to lose massive amounts of jobs. And there has been a study very recently of the Platform for Electromobility, together with the Boston Consulting Group, where they've looked at what would electromobility actually do to jobs. And we see here, I mean, you have different influences that kind of cancel each other out. So product mix has a positive impact. For example, what kind of cars are being sold, productivity gains. You need less labor force if every single laborer is more efficient. But the ones that are important are these on the right. Shift to EV, indeed, some jobs will get lost. So there are jobs. If you're today building a combustion engine, you probably won't be able to do that in 10, 15 years. At least not on the same scale. But we're gaining a similar amount of jobs in electromobility and related ecosystem. We need to build different kind of cars. We need charging infrastructure that needs to be deployed. So in the related fields, energy production, etc., jobs are coming back. So what's really crucial, it doesn't have to be a job killer. And indeed, we do need to make the switch, because if we don't, then China and the US do. And then we still lose the jobs, but we have nothing to replace them. We need to reskill and retrain the European workforce. And we need to make sure that the capacity of producing these new vehicles is in Europe and not elsewhere. So we really need to make sure that we're prepared for this transition and that the jobs stay here in the long run, and that's why we need to have an ambitious timeline. So this argument of, killing jobs is kind of a false argument, because the way of killing jobs is not making the transition. Right, so where are we today? And that's where I'm going to wrap up. We're at what we say the end of the beginning. So we had these old world challenges that we were discussing till now, if the transition to electromobility will happen, because we didn't have this phase-out date set, all these kind of things. Policy was often about, we need to subsidize cars because they're so expensive, electric vehicles, that people won't buy them without purchase subsidies. How do we make sure that they perform, that they have the range? It was only about cars. We weren't even talking about electric trucks yet. Infrastructure was mainly seen as a hurdle, and a lack of infrastructure. Will we have to supply was another big one. And now we're moving into the new world, where it is when and where exactly do we deploy electromobility. In policy, we're talking about broader mechanisms, instruments. Purchase subsidies are maybe not a long-term instrument, because they're becoming competitive. Scale is being achieved. So it's more about soft incentives maybe, or making sure that the EV driving experience is comfortable, that you can pay for charging, all of that. We're talking about additional segments, heavy-duty vehicles. Infrastructure is an opportunity, a business opportunity, for example. And we're talking about not whether we will have to supply, but how do we, well, not only at least, but also about how to ensure sustainable supply that is, environmentally friendly, takes care of human rights as well. And so what underpins this and what we have as a vision, we need 100% new zero emissions vehicles by 2030 to ensure fully decarbonized European road transport by 2050. And that's where I'm going to wrap up. If you have any questions, then happy to either answer them over supper, or email addresses are also here if you want to reach out in written. I hope I've kind of stuck to my 30 minutes, don't know. But yeah, thanks for listening, and see you around.
Thomas Neumann, i właściwie z tego, co powiedział, to jest jedyny właściwy, pożądany kierunek.